side and also in terms of business side for banks with tightening coming up. But we also see advancement on digitalization. We see focus on gender-related strategies, and we see increased focus on climate strategies. So that's the picture that we get, and I would like to invite Thomas and the rest of the panelists to debate this consideration and bring additional elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for this very interesting presentation. And we have a distinguished panel to discuss the results. We are very happy that you have been able to come this afternoon. And let me introduce my panelists, starting from my right, Ijeoma Osolumba, Executive Director and CFO at the Development Bank of Nigeria. We have Dr. James Mwangi, Group Managing Director and CEO at Equity Group Holdings. Dr. Beth Dunford, Vice President for Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank. And Admosu Tadesse, President Emeritus and Group Managing Director, Eastern and Southern Africa Trade and Development Bank. I think this panel can really not only answer questions in surveys, but actually try to make us understand what type of issues the banking sector has in front of us. And maybe have a tumultuous period, no doubt about that. We chatted about that just before we came in here. As a banker, it is a dramatic change and a couple of great hits with the COVID, with the war, and with the inflation that we now have and the rising interest rates, that really changes a lot of the environment that we operate in. And I would like to just give you a chance to give your take on what this new environment means for your activity. Just a brief round, if we start with you, Ijeoma, if you just describe what does this mean for your operations going forward?
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for coming. It's been, like you said, a tumultuous 2 years. I think we discussed in the morning, we had COVID, trying to recover from that, and climate, but also conflicts that we see around the region. In specific terms for Nigeria, just being Africa's largest country and just the sheer volume, the size of the population, just indicates how central it is to the discussion in Africa. But what we saw post-COVID in the last year, just similar to what's happened around the world and around the continent, inflation, cost of food prices with the war in Ukraine, but also the floods that we now see in the last 2 months, and just the devastation that that has caused to living conditions, but also looking in the future, the effect that that will have on harvest in the next season and livelihood. So looking at, we've talked about them yesterday also in the research, borrowing costs and banks tightening lending activities. Well, I think some of the positive sides also is that as Development Bank of Nigeria, we continue to work with our partners. And even though we saw some tightening overall in the Nigerian economy, we saw loans grow. And in our own specific intervention, we saw loans to small businesses also grow. We looked at, this week, I think in the World Bank annual meetings, we talked of financial inclusion and how that has also grown quite a bit during this period, looking at digitalization. And so the challenges remain, but I think interventions, we've been able to overcome some of the challenges, and we hope to do more also in the future.
Thank you so much. James, what is your take on what the current tumultuous period means for the operating environment?
Thank you. We are seeing a very volatile and uncertain and operating environment, and as a result, leadership is more focused on understanding evolving environment much more than ever before. I'm seeing us moving more and more to scenario planning as situation evolve very quickly. But I think there is an element of commoditization because things like inflation seems to be cutting across. It's no longer something you can ignore. We're now seeing volatility in interest rates, and we are seeing dynamics where countries are not acting in tandem and disrupting flows because of attractiveness, depending on the response from one country to the other. We're also seeing challenges with dealing with exchange rates because, again, that has been introduced. But beyond the economic crisis that we have to deal with, there are concerns like climate change. How do finance affect climate change? There are issues like social equity and parity. How do you deal with gender? How do you deal with micro and small enterprises? How do you deal with inclusion? How do you deal with equity? So in the basket of finance are many variables than ever before, both the technical variables of running a bank and more of externalities that have become pertinent issues that you can't run away from.
Thank you. Beth, what is your take?
So thank you very much for the question and really for that great presentation. There's so much going on right now in the world, but I think that just to mention, when we're really focused on inclusion, a trend that we really like to see, that we want to make sure that we maintain the momentum to increase access to internet and cell phone penetration. So the past decade, this has played an important role, as you all know, in really narrowing inequality and really contributed to reducing poverty. So this is really important momentum. We have to make sure that it continues. So again, making it possible to extend financial services to millions, and many of them are women. In 2020, 1.2 billion have been registered for mobile money, and more than half of those people are in Africa. So this is just a huge amount of inclusion that we want to make sure that this momentum continues. Now, another trend in this really challenging time is that we're seeing governments are looking to increase their domestic revenue. They have a lot to deal with, a lot of expenses. And we know that they're looking often to broaden their tax bases, increase their rates, and we have to really think about how this impacts financial inclusion, especially for women. So we know that women are often in the informal sector where it's harder to get money, and part of this difficulty in jumping to the formal sector is really sort of a lack of understanding and resistance to taxes. And of course, a lot of people don't like taxes, but I think that we just have to think about, do women have sort of the knowledge that they need to actually be able to understand, and negotiate the taxes that are being charged to them. So this is something I think we just really need to think about as the way governments really engage in revenue collection. It might be difficult for women to enter the formal sector. And I think that, as digitization is increasing, that provides more opportunities for women and other groups to get the information they need to engage in revenue collection streams. Another point, another trend that we know is really, really important is to making sure that there's space for the private sector as the government really turns to domestic markets to increase their access to finance and credit. International markets are tightening, and governments are looking domestically for credit. So I think that what that does is, of course, increases competition and prices, which makes it more difficult for private sector and can risk really crowding them out. We have to recognize that, when really governments are looking for revenue generation, that the private sector is the engine of growth for them going forward, and we have to make sure that there's space for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Admaso, how do you navigate in this environment?
Well, Thomas, my colleagues have adequately highlighted the issue of the mounting pressures we've seen on prices. We came into 2022 fairly auspiciously because we had realized that Africa was much more resilient than was thought. And of course, growth was looking good without stimuluses. Africa never had big stimuluses, but still we found a way to bounce back. And just as things were looking good, of course, new shocks came online. And these new shocks are now creating much deeper pressures because it's coming on multiple fronts. And now, of course, the financing costs are going through the roof. We saw the food crisis, of course, building up. So on the whole, I think what needs to really be done now is a refocusing on supply-side measures, because I think whether it was the COVID shock or the new shocks coming from the war in Ukraine, we have serious supply-side problems, right? That's what's driving inflation, that's what's driving food insecurity, energy insecurity on all fronts. And for me, I see maybe an opportunity for us to take advantage of this new, impetus around dealing with climate change, to pair that up with agricultural sector development and climate resilient infrastructure in the transport area, but also agricultural infrastructure. And I think there's some smart ways in which, we can take some actions to boost some of these interventions, because if you just look at the area of food losses, it's not obvious to everybody, but one thing that was highlighted recently was how food losses represent 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we were just to invest in agriculture by getting storage, cold chains in place, just to stem the loss issue, that would be a huge contribution to addressing climate change. Yet it would also support food security and of course deal with the issue of Africa importing so much food when it shouldn't. And of course that, as we know, exacerbates the Forex problem that we have now with the FFF crisis. So I mean, it's a very difficult environment around us, but I see opportunity. And I think this is where, Finance in Common Summit, PDBs like us, we can really find a way to redouble efforts on productive sectors that will help unlock the supply chain issues. We've always been focused on agriculture in Africa. The African Development Bank has always been passionate on that. We have the Vice President here. I think this is an opportunity to just redouble efforts, and we can hit multiple birds with one stone.
Thank you so much. It's very clear from all four of you that we have multiple challenges, a very difficult environment, but you point also to some of the opportunities that arises in this situation. And I think Deborah also showed that in her presentation, that we are making progress on some key areas of policy importance, such as gender finance, green lending, increased digitization, even during this period. And I think that says something about the strength in the sector. Ijeoma, if I turn to you again, at the research event yesterday on the special role that the development banks can play in the financial system, one of the key findings was that the effectiveness of these institutions in fulfilling their duties and mandates is closely linked to good governance and independence. Could you give us your thoughts and experience on that?
Thank you. The research that was done yesterday really resonated with me as Development Bank of Nigeria, and to thank the African Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and the AFD as well, but also the other partners that we have, KfW and World Bank. They come together to build a really credible organization. It's still young, it's just 5 years old, but governance has been at the central of how it was put together, just to insulate it from political interference. For instance, it was registered as a PLC, so it wasn't created by an act of parliament. So it's subject to the same rules as any public liability company, providing periodic returns to the SEC, but also regulated by the central bank. Another interesting thing is that the board is predominantly independent, so there's a predominance of independent directors on the board, and the management is selected, not appointed, so it's done in a market way, so international recruiting consulting firms recruit the board, both the independent board as well as management. But also the composition of the board with the development partners also being on the board. The African Development Bank is on the board, the EIB as well, as shareholders of the institution, and with the World Bank also having an observer status. So, and there is a lot of transparency and periodic information that we provide quarterly to all the development partners to see. So it's been a very successful model in putting that together by the development partners and ensuring that, for instance, lending decisions are not made by the government. There is no political interference. The board is the highest decision-making body, and does so in an independent fashion. And I think that has helped us to, over the last 5 years, create loans of over $1 billion to over 250,000 small businesses, predominantly women, 66% women, but also now focusing on how do we scale that, and how do we build on this model, and how do we continue to be a role model in Africa. We've had, based on our success, the Development Bank of Ghana is also being set up, but we've also had different organizations come from Africa, but also from the former Soviet blocs to understudy the DBN model. I think it's been a good journey so far, but like you said, and we discussed yesterday as well, governance is central to building out a public development bank, and this can be a test case and a role model for future in this area, and also a good instrument for continuing to catalyze additional funding to continue to make the impact that we do in Nigeria.
Thank you for that. Certainly a very important role model in also getting efficiency in operations via good governance. James, one of the main concerns we heard from Deborah in the survey for banks is the cost of local currency funding. We have the environment where central banks are increasing interest rates, they are stopping bond purchases, and borrowing becomes more expensive all over the globe. At the same time, bankers like to have some net interest rate margins, and in the very low for longer environment we were, that was put some pressure on that. What do you see ahead of you now in this sort of conundrum of rising borrowing costs, but also maybe possibilities of having a little bit higher margins and thereby a development that would be favorable? It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is true that the central banks have acted to set the signaling effect at the time of rising interest rates are with us, and we are seeing repeatedly most of them following the US Fed increasing by 0.75, so 75 basis points almost monthly. And as a result, just to ensure that economies protect themselves from flows, they have followed suit. And essentially, central banks, because of sovereign debt or bonds and bills that they issue, they compete with the commercial banks. So it means that the liability side is completely repriced as we speak, because we are all competing in the same marketplace, and depositors always seek to optimize on their return. The challenge comes when it comes to deal with the asset side, repricing the loan book so as to protect the margins. And then you suddenly realize that it's not as simplistic as passing of the increase in cost of funds to the borrowers on account of many factors. The first one is legal frameworks. For instance, in Kenya, there was interest capping until recently, and all loans, when the interest capping was removed, all loans that were issued during the interest capping have fixed interest until the end of their term. So there's nothing you can do to that loan book. You can't pass the additional cost. The second one is bearing in mind the risk of default and cost of risk. And you have really to choose whether you want increased interest rate at the risk of increased cost of risk, or you want to avoid the cost of risk and maintain. And simply, this situation is compounded by the fact that inflation, and we are seeing on average, global inflation is up by 10 percentage points. It's like everybody has been taxed 10% of their net worth. So essentially, the disposable income to pay loans have been reduced by 10% of the disposable income. And that really puts you in an awkward situation, because when you are evaluating a borrower, you evaluated based on the ability to pay. And that ability has been reduced by percent of the entire income. That really brings a huge constraint of consideration. And then, of course, you also consider if you had adopted an inclusive approach, for instance, gender, youth, whether they have the capacity to pass that cost themselves. If they have no ability to pass that cost, sometimes you are better off taking the cost. Otherwise, you take the cost of risk as they default. So those are the balls that we have in the air that we're juggling with. But ideally, if it is going to be long term, for sustainability reasons, then we would start find ways and means of repricing new loans, that naturally the new loans will be repriced. But however, the biggest challenge of this interest change by central bank is repricing the fixed income portfolio, particularly government bonds. So what we have now is yields on the previous stock has gone up, and as a result, mark to market is the bigger challenge that we are dealing with.
Thank you. Beth, you mentioned finance for women entrepreneurs as one important issue, and we see in the survey an increase in the share of banks that have sort of gender strategies. And there are also some evidence pointing to that female-led firms also in practice show a lower rate of non-performing loans. Do you recognize that from your own work, and where do you see the main obstacles going forward now to continue this promising development that we've seen?
Well, great. That was a very interesting finding, and I think that most of us who work in this area are not surprised. But just to back up just a little bit, we know that have access to credit, only 23%, right? And this is really this exists even though, despite significant gender-based discrimination, Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest percentage of women entrepreneurs in the world. It's 26% of women in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think at AFDB, we're really looking at sort of how do we remove this contradiction in the banking sector that is not, that is not lending to this sector that is so prevalent and again is seen to be reliable. So we know that banks perceive women businesses as risky investments. And that doesn't appear to be true. So I think that, are we mitigating risk with some of the work that we're doing, or are we mitigating bias, which is actually what I think we're doing? And financial institutions continue really to put out that really don't serve and respond to the needs of women entrepreneurs. So working to change this mindset obviously is key. So at the African Development Bank, first we looked at our own selves, what we're doing within the African Development Bank. And in our gender strategy, we're really looking to emphasize women's economic empowerment across everything that we do. Every operation of the bank, this is a key emphasis, and really recognizing that women's empowerment is really key to delivering on growth for Africa. So that's internally. Externally, we have the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, which is really seeking to bridge the $42 billion gap in financing for women-owned enterprises in Africa. So AFAWA, as we like to call it, has 3 prongs. The first is to increase women's access to finance. So it's through credit guarantees to mitigate the risk or mitigate the bias, I think as we'd like to say, risk of providing loans to women entrepreneurs. Second is providing technical assistance to women to help them enter the formalized sector where it can be easier for them to access finance. So we're working to make women bankable. So second, we're looking at providing advisory services to financial institutions to really enhance their understanding of what women businesses need so they can develop the products that will be suitable to women entrepreneurship. So really we're working to make banks womenable here. The third prong is really working working on the enabling environment that really allow women enterprises to thrive. This is policy dialogue with African governments, working on legal and policy reforms that are really, really critical. Just in closing, I just want to tell a quick story about Christine Ngiri, a Rwandan that I met last month, actually. And she went to financial institution after financial institution. Can I have a loan? No, 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 no. And so finally she was with one loan officer at a bank who was a man. And the man said to her, you're never going to get a loan. You don't have any collateral. And he said to her, but you're pretty, you should get a husband. So what Christy told us is right then and there, she had an idea for her business, which was to provide financial advisory services to women so no woman would have to suffer the humiliation that she felt and be told, again, that her dream was not achievable. So again, we're proud that she's one of ours at AFAWA and that we provided her an enabler loan to expand her business, to really reach more women, to help them gain the skills and the tools they need to enter the formal financial sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, for that. It's very important to hear these type of stories to get an illustration of what really can be done. At Masso, as you saw in the survey, it looks pretty positive when we ask banks on their expansion plans this year compared to last year. But on the other hand, the survey was done from, say, April to June. So, of course, the first effects had been visible, but since then we have even deeper challenges in front of us. Is this a game changer? Do you believe in that result, that the expansion plans still are there, or what do you see ahead of us?
The report, I think, picks up all the observations that many of us have also been seeing in the marketplace. I think after the the crisis, banks had been focusing on very tight portfolio management, but also being very accommodative, also being very thoughtful on debt management. And as we came out of the COVID crisis, there started to be a relaxation. So, of course, expansion was the order of the day. Underwriting standards were a little bit less defensive. So it was all looking like risk was on. And it has been on, but I think there's been a lot of changes in the lending environment, as we heard from James. Cost of funding clearly is so much higher across all currencies. Already in the African context, local currency cost of funding has always been much, much more higher than hard currency costs. And now both have gone through the roof. And of course, this creates headwinds because you don't have as many borrowers coming through in the same way as they have been in the past. And at the same time, you've had an unintended diversion of credit to the public sector because the public sector has, of course, stepped into credit markets in order to plug gaps where essential commodities are concerned. The markets all of a sudden are being really pressured in terms of access to Forex. I think Africa's biggest problem is we just import too much, right? I mean, if you have to import your food, you have to import your fuel, you have to import equipment, you have to, well, what are you not importing? And when you look at exports, it's really a very, very bad balance, right? And so balance of payments are in very difficult circumstances. And I think, you know, what it really does is it just reinforces again, you know, the imperative for us to get the productive side of the African economy going. First and foremost, I think food has to be the priority that we all emphasize and re-emphasize and re-emphasize because that's survival, right? But apart from that, I think when you look at the need for some level of stimulus in other economic zones of the world, for instance, in Europe, you know, Europe needs growth, needs some stimulation. I think there could be a very interesting connection between, you know, Africa being a very good source of demand for equipment, technology, and industrial goods out of Europe that can come in and boost agribusiness in Africa, boost resilient infrastructure. It could be a very nice tie-up, but I think we just need to find a way to connect the dots because when everybody pulls back, you end up with you know, continued stress, right? We're not unlocking the opportunities.
That's really true, and I think there is so much that we could do to strengthen the European-African type of cooperation in so many fields: energy, agriculture, advanced technology, IT. All of this are possibilities for all of us. We just have now a couple of minutes left. I would like you to you can get the chance of reacting to other things that you've heard here today, except for the questions that I have posed to you. So, Ijeoma, if you just get a minute, what would you like to say to the audience?
I think something that resonated with me that we talked about yesterday also in the research is this idea of integration in Africa financial markets with the rest of the world and how this is improving, but really it's on the back of liabilities rather than assets. So I think it re-emphasizes the fact that we borrow too much and don't create a lot of assets to reinvest. I think this is where public development banks and the multilateral banks also. The exchange rate crisis in African countries also something that resonated with me, and the fact that there was a recent study that was done that showed the stress in different countries and pointed to a number of countries where we kind of expect in the next few months kind of like an imminent debt default. That's very scary, and I think this is also a place where the multilaterals and the public development banks can come in and play a role.
Really important points. James, if you have a chance to reflect some final words.
I think as a leadership team, we have not been here before. We have not had the experience that we are going through. Maybe working together, learning from each other, collaborating and cooperating may see us through the turbulence and volatility together.
Thank you, James. And Beth, for the African Development Bank, I think you have a very important period ahead of you in this operating environment. What do you see as possibilities here?
Thanks. I wanted to go back to the issue of Forex, right? Of course, that's a very, very big subject. But when you're talking about sort of, you know, you're importing all of these things, what are you not importing? I think let's go back to like basics like food, basic staple crops. This crisis has really shown us sort of the fragility and the danger of depending on imports to meet basic food needs. Of course, this is hitting poor people very, very hard who spend already a huge amount of their income on food. This is very difficult for countries who are spending their precious forex on importing food. And, you know, Africa, 65% of the arable land in the world is in Africa. So again, Africa has the means and the possibility to dramatically increase its production. The tools and technologies for climate adaptive technologies for agriculture exist where they didn't maybe 20 years ago. So, you know, let's use this crisis as a forcing event to really get these technologies out to farmers at scale to dramatically increase production here in Africa. Really, in the next couple of agricultural seasons, we've seen Ethiopia do it in the matter of 2 to 3 years to really become self-sufficient in wheat. And we've launched the African Emergency Food Production Facility, which is really focusing right now in the next few seasons to get these inputs out to farmers, to use this as a way to do what we've tried to do for 20 years, which is scale these technologies to farmers to produce more here on the continent. I think it's an important moment that we need to seize.
Thanks. Admas, so let us tap into your thinking once more. Please, you have the floor for a final comment.
Just 2 quick points. I think we have a very good idea of what needs to be done. I think what's missing is the incentives to get all the different role players to actually step up and do what needs to be done. I think we don't lack the knowledge. I think what we lack is designing adequate incentives to get everybody to get up and move. And so that's the one point. And I think incentives need to be designed from both the public and the private sector side. I think also we need to think, apart from incentives, we need to think of protection. What do I mean by protection? During the COVID crisis, everybody said, let's protect enterprises because we don't want permanent damage to businesses because it takes decades to build up good businesses that are, of course, job creators. Now I think we need to start thinking of how do we protect financial institutions from being broken in this financial crisis time. Because with so many of the pressures mounting, I think there's a risk that there's going to be systemic problems on the debt side. And I think if we're not proactive enough to take that into account very early, we're going to miss the boat. I think the IMF has done an outstanding job. I'm a huge fan of what Kristalina has done there with the SDRs. But we need to make sure that the SDRs flow, because that is what is needed. I mean, it's not, of course, the panacea, but it's a huge jolt, you know, a huge injection in the arm. But you know, if it doesn't flow, if it's kind of not moving, it's a lost opportunity. And I think protecting the financial sector, Africa has made huge strides in building a robust banking sector. Our banking world has you know, come out of crisis over the 80s and 90s, and we're so proud of what we built. But now there's all these headstorms ahead of us, and if we're not careful, we're going to have permanent damage, and it's going to take us decades to rebuild again. EIB has been a strong supporter of our banking sector, but I think we really need much stronger efforts here to ensure that even sovereigns don't get permanently damaged. Ratings agencies, of course, have been downgrading so many of the sovereigns in the period of the COVID era, but it's going to get worse now with all these other pressures coming on the back of it. And if we're not careful, we're going to make it very difficult for private finance to flow into emerging markets and frontier markets. So I think we need champions. And I really would like to just highlight that the world has demonstrated what can be done when there's will. We saw it during COVID with the vaccines. We saw it during the Ukraine war. amazing amounts of resolve coming through and huge resources being made available. I think we can do it. It's just the political will, and I hope the leadership out there can make it happen.
Thank you so much. I am a former board member of the International Monetary Fund, so when you start the SDR discussion, I think we should arrange a new panel immediately after this to go into depth into that issue also, because it is interesting and very important. Thanks a lot. We could continue for a while, but there's a big screen here in front of us that says time out. So that means that we have to say thank you very much. Thanks to Deborah for doing the research and the presentation here today. That gave a good solid base for our discussion. And thanks to the panel for letting us tap into your wisdom and your experience. I think you really made life of the figures to understand the challenges of the banks today. So thank you very much to the audience, those of you who are here and those who are connected on the net. See you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks to the panel and thanks to you, Thomas, for this wonderful moderation. It is now time for a short transition. I invite you to stay in the room. Je vous invite à rester dans la salle parce que nous allons mettre quelques minutes de pause avant de reprendre une nouvelle session. High level panel.
We're going to stop a few minutes before starting the next high-level panel. And in the meantime, share your comments with the hashtag FinanceInCommon2022. Thank you.
La troisième édition du
third edition of the Finance Common Summit is taking place in Abidjan, in hallmark of Abidjan, Hotel Ivoire. Well, we've got various panels, different panels. And the next panel is Building Green and Quality Infrastructure for Sustainable Impact.
This is Laura Sabogara Reyes, Policy Advisor for Sustainable Finance at E3G. Please, you can start now.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of E3G with a distinguished set of panelists to discuss a very important topic on the road to net zero. Infrastructure is a key driver of economic prosperity as it facilitates the creation of jobs, facilitates trade, amongst many other positive spillover effects. Furthermore, infrastructure enables access to the basic needs we all rely on, namely energy, safe drinking water, education, health. The list is endless, both for urban and rural areas. However, these days, it is not enough for infrastructure assets to provide access to the services I just mentioned. In the face of the climate crisis, we need infrastructure to be resilient to the damages caused by natural disasters. We also need it to be inclusive, accessible, broadly available, and beneficial to all. On top of that, it should also be economically efficient and support sustainable development. In a nutshell, quality infrastructure really lies at the heart of the SDGs. Without it, we won't achieve any of them. However, because transformational and high development impact infrastructure projects are expensive, there is a tendency to trade off quality, environmental impacts, and development goals. This is especially true in the poly-crisis scenario we're living, in the face of the COVID-19 crisis, the recent developments of the war in Ukraine, inflation, as well as global food and energy security. This trade-off comes at the expense of sustainability in the long term, generating higher maintenance costs and other negative externalities that I won't bore you with right now for the sake of time. As such, and against this background, it has become ever clearer the importance of mainstreaming green and quality principles in infrastructure projects, thereby enabling investment in assets that are efficient, sustainable, resilient to climate change, and that can ensure a minimum of self-sufficiency in energy, agriculture, transport, health, and pharmaceutical capacities. I am delighted to be here and to have the opportunity of discussing this key issue with our highly distinguished panelists. Today, they will share with us their first-hand insights of the challenges that the planning and financing common of green and quality infrastructure poses. So allow me to introduce them. Today, here with us, we have, albeit virtually, Marie-Hélène Loison, Deputy CEO of the French Development Agency. Here in the room at my right, we have Dr. Megumi Moto, Vice President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency. We also have Mr. Mike Salowu, Infrastructure Urban Development Acting Director from the African Development Bank. We have Alice Huetza, Africa Regional Director of the WWF, and Carlos San Basilio, Managing Director, Corporate Strategy of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. So let me kick off this discussion by raising a question to each of our panelists as a first brief intervention, which will be then followed by a moderated discussion. Let me start with our panelists, joining us all the way from Paris, Marie-Hélène Loison. I would like to know what are the main challenges for public infrastructure met by AFD, and what are the tools that you have developed to address this? Marie-Hélène, the floor is yours.
Everyone in Abidjan, very pleased to be with you from Paris, and I hope that the start of the forum was interesting. First of all, just a few words to tell you that obviously green and quality infrastructure is at the heart of what the AFD Group is doing. So each year we dedicate around 7 to 8 billion euro for infrastructures through projects, credit lines, development policy loans, and expertise. And these projects have positive climate impacts. More than 80% of them actually have positive climate impacts. For all the reasons, Laura, that you just mentioned, there is an urgency to increase investments in infrastructures, considering that they have a wide range benefits that you just mentioned. And knowing this, we could support infrastructures and hope or take it for granted that they will contribute to SDGs. But obviously, as public development banks, we have to go further and in fact ensure that we support our partners in designing and implementing green and quality infrastructures. I would like maybe to mention 3 challenges that we are working on. The first one is when we speak about green and quality infrastructure. For us, it means that these projects should have positive impact on people, on planet, and on institutions. And we have to look at all these aspects together. Obviously, we all dedicate a lot of effort and resources to the energy transition. Adaptation is also high in the agenda, especially, but not only in vulnerable countries, and also protecting biodiversity. These will be very hot topics during the COP27. And these aspects are integrated in all the infra projects that we support and finance. But however, we strongly believe that we will not be able to achieve our planet agenda if it does not meet the people agenda. And this is really the idea behind the Just Energy Transition that was signed with South Africa last year in Glasgow. So how can governments and financing partners make sure that the transition will not increase inequalities, but on the contrary, create new job opportunities, encourage innovation, and reinforce social cohesion. I would like also to stress that we pay special attention to gender inequalities as infrastructure projects, especially transportation or water projects, for example, can have huge benefits for women if properly designed. And finally, we strongly believe that infrastructure development is also an opportunity to strengthen the efficiency and transparency of institutions, especially with regards to procurement, fight against corruption, and so forth. So this is really the first challenge and really strong point of attention for us, is to integrate all these aspects in the infrastructure projects on which we work. The second challenge relates to basically the need to define clear and consistent public policies and have good institutions to implement them. So we work through policy dialogue and public policy loans to support governments and local authorities in the development or revision of their public policies or regulations. And this is really the starting point for us to support institutional reforms that will promote green infrastructure or revision of water tariffs, or sustainable urban mobility plans, and so forth. So there is no point for us working on specific infrastructure projects if the institutional framework and the sector policies are not right. So for this reason, last year, public policy loans accounted for almost 20% of our financing in favor of infrastructure. This also allows us to make the link between policies and projects, basically making sure that each project is consistent with national policies. And this is, of course, especially relevant when it relates to NDCs defined to implement the Paris Agreement. So we thoroughly assess with our partners the alignment of each project with the country's NDC. And we also support the definition of public policies and investment programs that are needed to implement NDCs. And finally, we also pay special attention to reinforcing the financial and technical capacity of public actors to perform their missions, because we see that as a key condition to ensure the sustainability of projects. We do this through the provision of experts, training, and exchange of experience, in particular through our subsidiary Expertise France, whose mandate is to provide French public expertise to support specific reforms and encourage peer-to-peer dialogue. So the point is really, it's not only a matter of financing physical assets, but also of setting the policies right and of improving institutional capacities. And last, a challenge which is also key is project preparation, which is a critical phase, and for which we dedicate significant resources to ensure there is adequate preparation, both in terms of technical design, procurement, financing plan, operation maintenance, and so forth. So just to give you an example, AFD contributed to the Cities and Climate in Sub-Saharan Africa facility, which is a 12 million euro French, Swiss, and EU initiative aiming at preparing low carbon and resilient urban development projects in Africa. And this facility is now supporting 29 cities and has already helped to mobilize financing from AFD, but also other sources for investments amounting to around 500 million euro.
Thanks a lot, Marilyn. Indeed, it's very important to empower countries to actually be able to take ownership of all of that contribution that all the different banks provide to them, and to scale those initiatives and transform the sectors. I would then like to ask Dr. Megumi. JICA has been very active in advocating for quality and green infrastructure projects in developing countries. I would like to ask you why and how has this taken place? Has this call for higher quality infrastructure been successful or not?
Thank you very much. My name is Megumi Muto from JICA. I'm very honored to be on this panel. I think on the important aspects of quality infrastructure, Marie-Hélène has already outlined the main points. So I will summarize with my own word, which is transformative, which means infra projects that are best in catalyzing transformation for governments, local governments, people, and the private sector. And it is because of this transformational aspects that we witness in supporting infrastructure, we cannot help but continue supporting infrastructure. It's so satisfying. I will bring a case from Asia, which is an example of climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Metro Manila. With so many floods happening in many regions, I think adaptation and disaster risk reduction is something that is urgent, and let me share this experience. In Metro Manila, where there is a complicated system of rivers, at the first stage, we supported one just very simple, long waterway to detour water in the natural environment. So at the very beginning, it was a very simple, I should say, nature-based solution. But because of the massive urbanization, population explosion, and everything, we needed to protect the people by going into hard structures, dikes, from downstream to upstream. And through that process, the government started building capacities, flood engineering, flood engineers, and also policies, and the local government started doing relocation with human face. That was the second stage. And then the third stage came. The national government started to really think about climate adaptation, putting a lot of science in the design of infrastructure. And then the local government started to think about their disaster risk reduction plans. So the relocation of people became not like a social cause, but really an ex-ante behavior to protect the people. And then in 2020, Typhoon Ulysses came. It was almost like a super typhoon that hit the Metro Manila directly. And the result was the flood structures could mitigate 85% of the economic loss. And then the decrease of the people, affected people, from potentially 1 million to 0.03 million. So the result was there. But I think we have to think about the decades that took to come to this. And then we are working on the fourth stage. The Philippines government, they increase their budget size, and they are expanding their flood control projects in other regions. And then the other thing is, with the cooperation with the insurance sector, the Department of Finance is starting to insure public assets, and we are helping that with technical assistance. So all in all, what I wanted to underscore in this message is transformation is key. Choose the projects that transform and inspire others. That will be the key lesson from JICA projects. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Megumi. And you touch upon a topic that I already referred to in my opening remarks, and that also Marie-Hélène brought up, and that is the acute need for adaptation and the acute need for collaboration between the private, the public, and all sorts of sectors in society. With this, I would like to raise a question to Mike. The African Development Bank is the premier African financier. As such, it plays an enormous role in the region. I would like to ask you, how is the AFDB supporting its regional member countries in facilitating this necessary regional integration to foster exchange of lessons learned, whilst also promoting trade and private sector participation, whilst mainstreaming green and quality consideration? Mike.
Thank you very much, Program Director and dear panelists and participants. You're absolutely right. Africa is a massive continent which geographically demands that you have a regional interconnected infrastructure. So I think the African Union, based in Addis Ababa, has given us a blueprint that the African Development Bank support, and that's what we call Agenda 2063. The Agenda 2063 has a series, I think, about 9 flagship projects. One of them, to address the issue of infrastructure and regional integration together, is PIDA. PIDA stands for Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which is a strategic framework that identifies about 69 priority projects in infrastructure, transport, energy, water, and ICT to address Africa's infrastructure bottleneck. So the African Development Bank, due to its position as a premier institution, has led the preparation of that program. And that program, as we're speaking, the bank committed about $20 billion since 2012 to support the PIDA program. Now we are moved from PIDA 1 to PIDA 2. PIDA 2 still have 69 projects, about 163 billion in terms of capex and project preparation and also maintenance. That's a huge amount of money. If you look at the flow of money that goes to Africa in terms of infrastructure, according to our record, it's about 100 billion per year. So you can see the gap of financing that you need to actually mobilize, and that's where I think the Finance in Common platform like this actually is very important to mobilize. So what we've been doing is to support the planning exercise. So we do joint planning, continental planning through the PIDA. We also help to do the project preparation. And for that, the African Development Bank has put in place platform for project preparation. NEPAD IPPF is one of them that we manage at the bank, which focuses on preparing bankable projects. And I think my colleague from Agence Française de Développement has highlighted this constraint that we have on the continent. That's critical, and I'm happy to discuss that further. The second aspect we also do is once we have this project prepared, we need to de-risk them. So we have a series of de-risking instruments at the African Development Bank, as guaranteed product, partial credit guarantee, or PRGs, and we also have credit enhancement program to actually unlock private sector opportunity into this project, because government alone cannot finance this project. These are billions in terms of investment, and the fiscal cannot make it. So we need to crowd in private sector. So that's another role that African Development Bank plays very well by catalyzing private sector investment, by putting into, at the disposal this kind of instrument to catalyze. But once we do that, of course, the African Development Bank has the sector expertise, strong dialogue with the countries, and also have a convening power to also convey in terms of partners JICA, AFD, EBRD, EIB, and all the World Bank, we can convey them to rally around this kind of program, because this is a massive program that will unlock integration. So that's how we support integration, by putting regional connectivity at the heart of our planning. That's not enough. We still need to have the soft element of infrastructure. That's trade facilitation. So in terms of trade facilitation, the bank has been at the forefront with JICA here, to promote what we call one-stop border post. One-stop border post is a great instrument to actually facilitate cross-border trading and cross-border connectivity by facilitating cross-border, because that's one of the bottlenecks. You can put infrastructure in place. You can build a railway from here to Morocco. But if each time you need to cross a border, you need to stop the train, okay, check, spend 5 days at the border with trucks and everything, then you're not realizing the benefit of regional connectivity. And I think that's very important, the soft element that we play. So these are some of the things that the African Development Bank does to actually promote regional integration, and also trade finance. You cannot talk about regional integration without talking about trade. Africa intra-trade is still very low. We talk about 15% globally, although per region, this is different, right? Some regions are much more advanced in terms of intra-African trade, but our role as the African Development Bank is to facilitate intra-African trade, and we do that through a series of instruments. One of them is trade finance. We put about almost $2 billion into trade finance to support about 1,900 transactions to support trade, of which we have roughly about 30% of that amount to promote intra-African trade. We do trade with the world, but we need to enhance intra-African trade, and that's where the African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually critical, and we need to support that by putting the right infrastructure, the right policy environment, and the right capacity in our countries in terms of production capacity to actually leverage that kind of agreement. And that's what I can respond for now, but I'm willing to come back again with more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Indeed, and I think that it is worth highlighting the need for cooperation and collaboration, and this is exactly what we're doing. We're exchanging, we're learning from one another, and this is particularly relevant because each region has its own challenges, but there's always something to be learned. Let's move on to allies. Much has already been said yesterday during the research conference, and right now it was also hinted at it's a related issue, adaptation, about how there is an urgent need to tackle the so-denominated twin crisis of climate change and biodiversity. As such, I want to ask you, in your opinion, why is this so important, and what are the adequate means to take into consideration biodiversity, climate, and environmental risks when designing transformative infrastructure projects? Alice.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. We had, as you said, you just said, rightly said, everybody's talking about the triple risk, right? The CCC. And we know that in order to resolve those issues, we're going to have to increase our ambition. We're going to have to invest. And I think the bank has just talked about a lot of 20 billion, 160 billion being invested and to deal with these crises. But given the long-term nature of infrastructure projects, it means that we need to take into consideration the environmental, economic, and social issues when we design them. So together with the bank years ago, WWF, we did something called the Africa Ecological Footprint, because we realized at the time that there was a lot of investment starting to come in and planning to come in, but then we needed to think about what that will look like, especially given that we want these economic aspirations. What does that mean for nature? Which parts of our nature do we want to keep, and which ones are going to be impacted? And we produced the Africa Ecological Footprint, and later we also worked on the Africa Ecological Futures report, and the futures allowed us to draw scenarios that said, okay, in the event that there's going to be more roads here, this is how they are going to affect forests, and this is the mitigation plan. So there are 3 reasons why this is extremely important. First and foremost is that most of the infrastructure in Africa overlaps with areas of high biodiversity. So it's either going to be oil exploration, the East Africa oil pipeline in the Murchison Falls National Park. That is a premier park in Uganda, which is important for wildlife. But of course, oil is important too because of jobs and the economic opportunities. So we need to know that there has to be a way to mitigate that. So that becomes very important for us. So we need to do a risk assessment, but we also have to have a mitigation plan. And first, do no harm to nature and to people. The second one, of course, is that infrastructure projects themselves face environmental risks. They have serious risks. Financial, the risk of losing. If you don't design it properly, it can fall. There's also reputational risks. If you go ahead and invest in a mine and everything else, there's always this reputation. Your reputation will be bad. And we've seen many examples of that. But the third one also is that the financial risks due to failure to manage those risks are also there. Because then if you go ahead and not invest, in fact, I think there's a study I saw that shows that 200 projects, of the 200 projects that faced environmental and social related conflicts, 36 were cancelled, 116 faced cost overruns, and 162 projects faced delays. So clearly, if you do not take into consideration these environmental and social risks at the beginning, it's bad for your reputation. It can be bad for money as well. I'll stop there for now.
Indeed. And I think we're already picking up on some takeaways from this discussion, although we're not yet over, and that is the need for a holistic approach. It's not only about financing, it's also about the people perspective, it's also about the policy framework and the analysis that needs to go into the appraisal process of any project that banks approve. Now I would like to move to Carlos. Carlos, I'm very curious about how EBRD, as a global MDB, is leveraging it on its European anchor and global exposure to expand the green agenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to FIX for inviting us to this event. And well, I would say that EBRD started indeed as its operations in Europe, but has been expanding it way beyond, to the east, to Central Asia, all the way to Mongolia, to the south, around the Mediterranean, including the Northern Africa. But across all these region of operations, we have kept the common principle in terms of pushing the green agenda as one of the top priorities in what we do. So we are applying the same policy across all our countries of operations, of course, and to push for the green agenda, as you were asking for, Laura, we need two things: the right people and the right processes, because we want to make sure that in every activity we do, green is at the forefront. Whether it is investment, whether it is policy advice, or whether it is capacity building. In terms of investment, for instance, it's not only that it's incorporated in every project we invest in, but also that we have assigned some specific targets to green when working in our region of operations. For instance, we have a target which is that by the end of this year, all our portfolio has to be compliant with Paris alignment principles. Also that by 2025, at least 50% of our investment has to be in the green space. And I have to say that we've been delivering well on track, and last year we were also at 50%. This year we may deviate a bit because of the impact that the war in Ukraine is having, but we're going to be very close. But it's not just about investment. There's something also relevant, very relevant, that was mentioned by some of my predecessors, like Marie-Hélène, which is policy. In terms of the policy advice we give to the governments we work and to the sub-sovereigns we work with, green is now at the top of the priority. So we work very closely with them in the development, in the design and implementation of the long-term strategies, also on the national determined contributions, NDCs, because it's important that you make these two processes go together, the investment and the design of the policy. So every investment is part of a broader plan. So here is where we think there is more room to go. Also here in Africa, but across the world, we think that the development of LTS and NDCs still has a way to go, and we hope that in COP27 we can give another push, and I think that MDBs can have a big role to play to play here. The same as on capacity building, in working with the private sector, in the local communities, to make sure that they develop also the right policies and the right investments to be aligned with the green agenda. And what's the outcome? In our case, for EBRD, the outcome has been quite positive, but with one significant caveat. It's positive because we have mobilized, we have invested against our own portfolio a significant amount of funds, close to 6 billion annually, last year and this year. We have mobilized on top of that some additional 18 billion euros, so that's significant. But the caveat is that it's mostly on mitigation. So where we are finding difficulties is to find bankable projects in the private sector on adaptation. And this is still an open issue where for us and other MDBs there's a lot of improvement. The last comment from my side is that for us to deliver in the sustainable infrastructure arena, it is very important that we come with high standards in terms of environment, integrity, gender, you name it. But it's also very important that we, as investors, come with the efficiency tools to allow for a quick delivery. And to achieve that, nothing more important than coordination among MDBs. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. And indeed, I think one of the recurring points that all of you have raised is the need to involve the private sector to crowd in that investment to scale up. So let me go back to Marie-Hélène. Marie-Hélène, what are those tools developed by AFD Group that have helped you mobilize the private sector to achieve this investment that we need for sustainable infrastructure development?
Yes, we all know that public investment will not be sufficient to finance the infrastructures needed to achieve the SDGs. So I will just mention 3 ways through which we work to mobilize the private sector for green and quality infrastructure. The first one, well, we have mentioned it already, but it's basically the need for clear policies and strong public institutions. They're key for public investments, but they're crucial for private investment. And in countries where, tariff paid to IPPs are low or legal contractual arrangements are not solid, we can observe that there are very few, if any, private investment. Second way is de-risking. Thanks to the support also of the EU, we have developed a public payment guarantee that covers the risk of a public counterpart defaulting on its payment obligation. It's called the European Guarantee for Renewable Energy, and it targets renewable energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa. The third way is equity, because infrastructure projects require large amounts of equity. We invest alongside private sponsors, and we created with the French Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations a 600 million euro infrastructure fund in 2017 called STOA, dedicated to infrastructures in developing and emerging countries. STOA basically complements what our subsidiary Proparco can do, as it can invest bigger amounts, usually between 15 and 50 million euro, and totally 400 million euro were invested in 13 projects, mainly in renewable energy, but also transportation, water in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. And these projects will have impacts on SDGs, for example, 1.5 gigawatts of additional renewable energy, or 17 million people having access to electricity, and 2.6 million tons of CO2 saved per year. So these are just a few examples of how we're working to mobilize the private sector.
Thank you for sharing those. I would like to raise a follow-up question to Dr. Megumi, and that relates to blended finance. A lot of you have mentioned the need for de-risking instruments, but also the need for partnerships among the different public development banks, and how that is key to develop affordable quality projects whilst taking into consideration the latest state of the art. And I personally believe this is an extremely important point, because as you all hinted at during your interventions, public development banks are not only financiers, they're also thought leaders. They also are trailblazers with their policy development. So if you could share your experience with us, Dr. Megumi.
Thank you very much. Before going into that question, let me just follow up with what Solomon was saying on planning together. For Africa, especially for this region, JICA, as JICA, we are working on this master plan, which is called West Africa Growth Ring Corridor Master Plan for Transportation, covering Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Burkina Faso, Benin, even connections to Nigeria. And here, we are not just talking about transport infrastructure. We are talking about a soft transformation in value chain, agriculture, and industry. So we are starting to contribute in this region as well with the help of our colleagues here. So going back to this question on blended finance, let me share with you a classical case that we did once again in the Philippines, a water revolving fund. This was a joint scheme with a JICA concessional loan to a public development bank and a USAID DCA guarantee coming into the picture. Now I think it's the Development Finance Corporation. And then we mobilize commercial local lending for targeted water districts nationwide. And you know very well that water districts, utilities in developing context, there are maybe several bankable ones, not so bankable ones, and of course there are others that really need a lot of capacity development and maybe subsidies. But these ones are really reaching out to the most vulnerable sections of the country. And there, what we did, or the Department of Finance of the Philippines did, was classify the water districts into the bankable and the quasi-bankable and the non-bankable ones. And with the blended finance, together with the USAID, we could focus on the bankable and the non-bankable ones and make make the finance happen. And then for the not bankable ones, the Philippines government could really focus their subsidies, technical assistances, and other supporting measures and make the total system, making sure that the total system caters to the growth of the water utilities and at the same time taking consideration of the needs of the poor and the most vulnerable. So in blended finance, with the combined with a policy creation, we make sure that as a system, it will deliver to the populations that we as development financiers care most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Megumi. So we've covered the theory and how important it is for projects to be ready, for projects to be accompanied, for projects to be taken to a sufficient maturity level so that they are bankable. I would now like to ask you, Alice, which innovations can be introduced in order to minimize the negative impacts we've been talking about to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals through sustainable infrastructure? So, namely, what are those social, environmental, climate considerations that are musts?
Thank you very much. So maybe one example I could give is in Kenya, where I live, we have what's called the standard gauge railway. And this railway has been built to go through a national park. And obviously that initial assessment shows that if you build it the way it is, it's going to affect wildlife movement. So what do? You build underpasses or you build flyovers so that in that case you can still have the railway, but you still retain corridors for these wildlife to pass. And I think there's a lot of this happening in India. There's a lot. Obviously the design is important. So that's we're seeing those as good ones. Another one really is, instead of building seawalls to manage flooding, you rehabilitate and restore mangroves. I think that's a good one also that we're hearing more often. But also there's the one around nature positive and biodiversity net gain. I think you've heard about the mitigation hierarchy. So you do the avoid, the minimize, restore, but finally you also have to offset the residual impacts. And we've seen many examples of offsets where dams are being built, but looking at the harm in one place, you restore by another place. Of course, robust metrics are important. When you do work like this, you need to make sure you have metrics that can measure the impact, but also continuously monitor any unintended consequences. So we're seeing a lot of those, but there's also commercial advantages of this, of net gain. It sends a very strong message. All these banks, if they're doing this, of course, that's why we're here, right? The finance in common. We're talking about the importance of us working together for SDGs, working together for climate action. It's extremely important now that we have the banking sector involved. It's no longer the case for us who work in conservation anymore. We see a lot more partners coming on board, and that's important because we can't do it alone. And so it's really very good. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for grounding a little bit more and making it a little more tangible for our audience. So now let's move to another scenario. Right now, Alice was talking to us about the social, the environmental considerations. I'm very curious, looking at what is happening right now in Ukraine, Carlos. For EBRD as a European MDB, how would those principles be taken into account in the post-crisis reconstruction effort?
Well, what is already pretty challenging is to see how you apply these principles even now during war, because we from our side, EBRD, we keep on investing in Ukraine and of course in the neighborhood countries. And here you pointed right to the fact that we have to, maybe not to deviate, but we have to reinterpret our principles in responding to the urgent needs of our countries of operations. And in the case of Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, also some other countries, there's need of support, for instance, to fund the provision of gas. There's need also to strengthen the pipeline and the network to allow for bigger traffic of and alternative sources of gas. So it is important, I think, here, if you think about it, probably you have to combine some degree of flexibility with consistency, because you cannot deviate from the ultimate goal, because the current crisis in terms of if you look at energy, it even strengthens the case for a transition beyond the very strong case we already had before as a result of climate change. So here we have to make compatible what we are funding now in terms of the urgent needs with the medium-term and longer-term perspective of a future with renewable energies and the lack of dependence on fossil fuels. And that's what we're doing. In EBRD, we have the possibility of funding gas-related projects under certain conditions, under certain parameters to ensure consistency with the green transition strategy of the country. That's what I said also before, that it's important that every country has a very clear path as designed by the LTS. But we do that, for instance, to make to give an immediate response to the needs, but in combination with other projects, other investment that can, if any, speed up the process towards a green transition. So you have to be flexible, but you have to be even more cautious that you are not locking in any installation that would prevent a green transition in the future, Laura. So difficult as it is, we think we're getting there.
Extremely difficult. I agree. So our discussion is slowly coming to an end. It's been fascinating speaking to all of you. I would like to sum up, in my own words, what my main takeaways or what I take back to Berlin to discuss with all of my colleagues from what we just spoke. And afterwards, I would really kindly ask you in 1 minute to summarize what you're taking away. So the first point I think that came up a lot was the need for a holistic approach that fosters development of policy. So finance with policy. The need for collaboration, and that's what we're doing, right? Finance in common. The need to exchange lessons learned, to go to other regions. something that Carlos just said that I think it is key is that context matters and that we need to be flexible. We need to react to the needs of the people. And finally, of course, the coordinating of the private sector. And with that, we have 5 minutes, so I will ask each of you to please sum up what you take away from this discussion. Dr. Megumi. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think I will stress the importance of capacity, not just the ones doing project formulation and implementation, but the capacity of the development financier side as well. For example, especially in this region, in East Africa, in a lot of countries you need the French. So even I, every Sunday at 3 p.m., I'm sitting in an online French class. So capacity on both sides is very important in order to collaborate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, indeed. I also need to get on with my French. Mike, please, what do you take away from this discussion?
Thank you very much. I think there are 2 things for me. One is the issue of quality infrastructure. You know, we cannot do away with the fact that it costs money to have quality. It costs money at the entry. But if you take a life cycle approach to infrastructure development by integrating all the green and everything, then you are actually likely to gain in the long run. But at the entry point, it costs money. So, and if you add the green perspective to it, then it costs even more money. Our calculation in the bank is saying to us that on average, you're looking at 4 to 5% of incremental extra cost to green your infrastructure, make it more climate resilient. So I was listening to you with a lot of passion, but I know it costs money. So that's why in African Development Bank, we're trying to push for what we call climate action window, which is an extra window that the bank is pushing to actually help the African member countries to tackle this green and quality infrastructure, particularly in meeting their net zero transmission. That's number 1. Number 2 is it does take partnership. You know, that's critical. Us here on this panel, if we collectively put together all our instruments, our funding and capacity, we can actually do a whole lot. So I think going together, you go far. So that's what we want to do. You know, have a joint partnership, promote partnership that is really supporting African development agenda. And I think this is one of the things that I will take away from this panel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Alice.
Thank you. For me, it's about changing the narrative. Yes, we are facing a triple challenge, but it could also be a triple opportunity. So the discussion doesn't always have to be about mitigating negative impacts. It can also be about creating green infrastructure that results into opportunities for people and planet. And I think with a collaboration, all of us in this room, we can work together to really create high impact and green infrastructure that creates jobs and skills and social protection for our people.
Thank you. Carlos?
Thank you. I will just follow Alice, a good positive tone and put also some burden on our side, the side of the shoulders of the MDBs, because to deliver this on this bright future, we have to work in better cooperation and on 2 clear areas. One is agreeing with the recipient countries in terms of the standards to make sure that the infrastructure is really sustainable from all angles. So agreeing and having a common set of standards is going to make all our lives easier. And second is in terms of mutual reliance among MDBs when co-financing large infrastructure projects, because mutual finance, mutual reliance will help speed up the whole process, will help us deliver faster, and will facilitate also the life of our clients. And this is something where we have taken some steps as MDBs, but where there are definitely more to take. Thank you.
And of course, Marie-Hélène, what are your takeaways from this discussion?
Well, Laura, you summarized very well our discussion, I think. I really fully support what was just mentioned about the need to have a common definition about what is green infrastructure and, in fact, what is green finance. The second takeaway is I think public development banks should play a key role in reconciling short-term needs and long-term issues, as well as local concerns and global issues. And I think this type of discussions will be at the forefront during the COP27, and it's important that we help devise solutions to address them.
Thanks a lot for that, and I can only say I also took part yesterday in the research conference, and I'm thrilled to hear that various points that were discussed yesterday have come up today. So I thank you, all of you, for your attention, and of course our panelists for sharing with us their insights, for letting us pick their brains a little bit. And yeah, my main message would be, let's keep working together for finance in common. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura, and all the speakers for these interesting words. Nous allons marquer à présent une courte pause. Je vous propose de rester dans cette salle. Nous reviendrons juste après pour une nouvelle session de panel sur... In a few minutes. Thank you.